You're listening to the ADHD Support Talk Radio podcast. ADHD Support Talk Radio is sponsored by ADDclasses.com. Visit www.addclasses.com to sign up for free webinars today. Well, hello and welcome back to ADHD Support Talk Radio. I am your co-host, Lynne Edris, and I'm a productivity coach, and I help overwhelmed professionals get their procrastination under control, improve their time management, and get more done with less effort so that they have more time, more energy, and even more money for what they love most. As a woman with ADD myself, I've been where so many of you guys are right now, and I've been where so many of my clients are, and I've come out the other side, so to speak. I've gone from living in that constant state of chaos and overwhelm and underperformance to a life of more success and more fulfillment than I ever thought possible at one time. And I know you guys can share the same success too. You can learn more about me, what I do, and the programs and services I offer at my website. It's www.coachingadvantages.com. And when you sign up on my website or text the keyword HACK, that's HACK, to 444999, I'll send you my 7 foolproof productivity hacks to help you add hours of free time to your weeks by investing just a few smart minutes each day. Today I want to talk about one of my most fundamental but most important things I teach my clients to do to help them improve their productivity. On the surface, it looks like a simple strategy, but it's a strategy that's rooted in your executive functions. And of course, I'm not a big fan of focusing on strategies without getting to some of the underlying stuff that's necessary to make those strategies work, like getting your perception and your thinking and your belief in line with what you're trying to accomplish, without understanding your strengths, without understanding how you work best, and that sort of core fundamental stuff that we do in coaching. But this is a universal strategy, and it's a strategy, again, rooted in how your brain works and why it works that way. So to understand why the strategy works so that you can make it work for you, you have to understand a little bit about your executive functions and ADHD. So really briefly, really generally, there are lots of different models of executive function, lots of different theories. I'll give you my sort of layman's term explanation of executive function, and then we'll talk about the 2 particular executive functions that come into play when it's hard for us to get started on stuff, when it's hard for us to actually accomplish the things that we need to accomplish. The 2 that are most impactful on our productivity. So your executive functions, again, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a neuroscientist, but this is my sort of layman's term explanation that I give my clients. Your executive functions are those higher order mental processes that are involved with things like memory and prioritization and decision making and regulation and lots of other things. I always think of them as like the human only functions that your brain does. Your executive functions also coordinate different mental processes together, sort of like the orchestra conductor of your brain or the CEO of your brain functions. And your executive functions are also energy intensive. I always call them brain fuel hogs, right? So your executive functions burn a lot of brain energy. They burn a lot of actually glucose. And that's the way I explain it to clients. The 2 executive functions that are most impactful on our productivity when you have ADHD are the one that we call activation and the one that I call mental organization of information. And again, there are lots of different models. Russell Barkley calls the one that I refer to as mental organization of information. I do believe he calls that mental play. And there are different ways to look at this. But activation, for starters, is simply getting started on something. It's all of the mental processes and all of the things that your brain needs to do to actually activate, or sometimes this is called initiate on a task, right? It's simply just getting started. The mental organization of information is all of the different ways that in your mind you make sense of information while you're using it. So, for example, prioritization, putting things in order, putting things in sequence, thinking about the steps in something. When you're doing all of that in your mind, that's all of that mental manipulation of information or mental organization of information. That's another executive function. So both activation and that mental organization of information are executive function, energy intensive activities, right? So they're literally burning the same fuel from the same fuel tank. or metaphorically, they're burning the same fuel from the same fuel tank. They're literally both burning glucose at higher rates than other kinds of mental processes do. So when we struggle with things, especially those executive functions, we want to make sure that we do what we can, first of all, to externalize those executive functions, to have the things that those executive functions are doing for us, find ways outside of our bodies to compensate for those executive functions. Simple example for that is wearing a watch or always having a clock in view to help support your executive function challenge with time sense, right? ADDers tend to be time blind. So always having a clock in view, always having a watch is one way to externalize time. Lists are ways to externalize our executive function struggles with memory. A good task management system is another way to externalize your executive function struggles with mental organization of information and memory and all of that, right? So we know that both activation and that mental organization of information are both executive function energy hogs. So when you are trying to decide what to do next, you're trying to plan, you're trying to figure out what action to take next, and then you're trying to get started on it, sometimes that mental organization that's required in the deciding piece takes enough processing power, takes enough of that, executive function fuel in the executive function fuel tank, so to speak, that you don't have a lot left over to activate. So one of the very simple things that I encourage my clients to do is to find ways to separate the deciding from the doing. So separating the deciding, separating the planning, separating the prioritization from actually getting started on the task. So if you can separate with some span of time or some other kinds of activities, your process for figuring out what you're going to do when, in some way from actually getting started on whatever it is that you intend to do, you may have more energy and you may have more focus and you may have more ability to activate and get started on that thing. And there are as many different ways you can do this as you can imagine. Most of my clients don't love the word planning. Most of us with ADD have sort of a love-hate relationship with planning. Some of us are over planners, so we burn ourselves up. We use all of our energy up with making the perfect plan. Others of us find it really hard to sit down and force ourselves to plan. But when you're determining what action to take when, that's a form of planning. So if you can call it whatever you want, I actually call it setting myself up for the next day. I have clients that just call it the deciding, and that's okay, right? But that form of planning is an important thing for us to do. If we're not planning in some way, again, no matter what you call it, if you're not planning in some way, you're letting whatever comes into your attention direct your action. So you're reactive, your whole day is dictated by email, your whole day is dictated by whatever comes into your attention or whatever sort of fires need to be put out in the moment. And that's not proactive. That's not moving anything forward. That's just basically treading water and keeping up. And most of us do a lot of that. So when you know what's coming next, when you know what actions you're going to be taking when you have a plan, no matter what you call it, it's a lot easier for you to move the important things forward and not just be reactive and not just put out fires. And making that plan, making that deciding, making that setting yourself up outside of your head is important. Again, you want to externalize the things that you're doing as executive functions. So all of that mental organization of information, all of that prioritizing and sequencing and deciding and remembering what needs to be done, if you can do that outside of your head in an app or software or a notebook or a notepad or whatever, that's going to be a lot more effective for you. But that's not enough. It's not enough just to have a plan. We can still have trouble executing the plan or activating or getting started when we need to if we're not careful about when we plan with respect to when we actually intend to get started. So anytime that you have to make a plan, decide what comes next, it can really be helpful to separate that from the actual getting started by some chunk of time or some other kind of activity that isn't quite so executive function intensive. I hope that makes sense. But you've got to give your brain a chance to recharge. You've got to give your brain a chance to sort of fuel back up, so to speak. And remember, the planning or the deciding and the getting started or the doing are both taking from the same energy source. So again, conserve that energy, make it easier for yourself to actually get stuff done, and start looking at how you can separate the deciding from the doing yourself. Hope that gives you something to think about, just a little quick tip. And if I were doing this with a client, we'd look at, how they process information, how they do things naturally, what already works for them, sort of the ebb and flow of their day, the ebb and flow of their focus and their mental energy. You don't want to slate your planning. You don't want to slate your deciding part for a point in your day when your energy is really low, or a point in your day where your focus is really low. You don't want to slate your planning for a time in the day when you're prone to interruptions, right? You want to look at your life, look at how you do things most naturally, how you do things most effectively, what you're already doing now that's working well, and figure out how to make these things work for yourself. You can't try to plug yourself into someone else's way of doing things. It very rarely works. So I hope that's given you something to think about, just a little fundamental, foundational piece of what's so important for you to be able to really have your productivity meet your potential. Again, I'm Coach Lynne Edris. I hope that makes sense. If you have questions on any of that or anything, please join us in the ADHD Support Talk Radio community on Facebook. I'm happy to answer your questions there. Just tag me. As always, I appreciate your time and I appreciate your attention. And thanks for listening. Take care.